Hi, my name is Paul. Welcome to part 3 in a 6-part series that we're putting together on internationalization and Next.js. Now, I know what you're saying to yourself. What does this guy mean? I still don't know anything about internationalization. How can that be? I'm at part 3 on a 6-part series on the subject. Well, the thing is that we've only covered the absolute basics. We started in video 1 with the roll your own style implementation of internationalization in a Next.js app. Video 2, we reviewed 3 of the most popular packages that are used for internationalization. And then we chose a winner and suggested one that we think is going to work for most projects. So, where does that put us? Well, we're at the point now where most series on the subject stop and people don't necessarily go further than. And we actually have quite a lot of experience in this area, and we want to help the world, I guess, understand more about what it actually takes to run one of these projects, the things that you're likely to run into, and help you get over some of those challenges. If you've done the implementation of internationalization on a Next.js progress on your team or in your organization, everybody's probably looking at you like you're more or less a genius right now because you've done something that, 3, 5, certainly 10 years ago was either impossible or really hard. And you're able to do it, with an hour of video or a handful of guides. But what happens when you sit down to your next meeting and your team looks across the table at you, the internationalization guy, and looks for answers to the problems that you're about to run into as this project goes live or as it grows? They're going to expect you to have the quick answers the way you did for coding everything up. And all of a sudden, you may not feel like quite the genius anymore, and you aren't going to have the answers, again, if you don't know the material covered in this video and in the rest of the series. So today I want to close some of those gaps. Think of this video as bridging the gap between technology and policy. Policy may not be the best word for it, but it's that domain of things. I think it's a decent way to frame it. So we're going to break down the content of this video into 3 main areas. 1, new locales. 2, translation quality. And 3, international law. Part 1, new locales. Okay, so we're going to assume as a baseline for this video that your application is already internationalized and that you've gone through the steps in part 1 and part 2 of this series for your application, meaning the internationalization capability is built in, regardless as to whether you have one locale or 100 in there. It has the ability to be localized. So if you do only have one locale, obviously at this point you're going to want to add more, or if you already have 2 or 10 and you want to add more, you're going to have to go through a process to decide which locales you want to target. Because regardless of how you do this, there is going to be some additional investment there. So let's figure out a framework for how to choose those new locales. All right, so let's say in scenario number 1, you already have your website or your project live. Well, then you're almost certainly going to have some analytics that are going to show you that some of your users are not from the geography of your default locale, which means that a decent number of users perhaps are willing to use your product regardless of the fact that you don't have it localized in their native language. So that's great. That's an excellent opportunity to expand into those locales by simply adding new translations for them and giving them a more comfortable user experience and making it easier for them. Okay, so scenario 2 would be maybe you don't actually have users from a foreign locale or geography already using your product, but you do know that there is strong conceptual overlap or strong interest in the sort of product or service that you're offering in different geographies. And so, one, if you already know what those are, that's great. You already know which locales to target. But if you don't, this can actually be accomplished with just a bit of research. Just search for, interest in your product or service in this locale or in this locale. And you'll probably get led down the rabbit hole of information that tells you, somebody will have spoken on this subject at some point somewhere online. So use that research as a basis to decide what you should be targeting next. Then once you've done that, you're going to start having a larger and larger list of locales. By the time you get to, let's say 8, 10 or something more, you're going to have a pretty big list. And the thing is, it might not actually be easy to parse if that content, say, is, EN for English, and as was the case in our demo app, in videos number 1 and 2. For Dutch, you use NL. Well, that abbreviation may not be meaningful for people who are looking at your content in all these different languages. So adding a little flag icon next to each locale in your locale selector can be very helpful to confirm that, okay, yeah, NL does actually mean Dutch in this case. We will cover adding the flag icon to your locale selector for each locale and a follow-up video. I think that'll be in the fourth video. So the next one in this series. But I want to keep this video more of a discussion. And I know this channel is targeted more at the dev side of things, but I would urge you to stick around and hear what I have to say on this stuff because it'll just better arm you for actually managing these processes. Okay, on to part two, which is going to be a bit more involved. This is going to be on translation quality. So you're going to have to decide, how do you plan to manage translations? Do you plan to do machine translation or human translation? Now, these are very different options and they come with very different costs. So if you use something like machine translation, obviously everybody's aware of the new AI tools that do a really good job of this. Google Translate and DeepL remain really strong options. Our preference is DeepL. We've seen that the quality tends to be a bit higher. If instead you decide to go with human translations, one of the initial questions you're going to have to address is, what is the format of the data that is needed for exchange between your team and likely external translators? Is JSON acceptable, or do your JSON files need to be converted to Excel and then given to perhaps your internal team to hand off to the translators and then worked with by the translators and then given back to your team and then back to you to re-implement as JSON? If that's the case, one of the things that's going to be really critical is making sure that everybody internally and externally understands that the keys that you're using for translation cannot be changed, because otherwise it's going to make it really hard to merge the information back into your application. It can probably still be done, but it's a conversation that's best to have early on, so you can just avoid that headache from the outset. Okay, let's say you're going with human translations, and let's say, for instance, that your content is already translated. You've already been down this path once. You already know what you're working with. The reason I say that is because I want to talk through some more of the workflow issues that aren't necessarily obvious with your initial step when you're exchanging these files and going through the process initially. You go through it once, everything seems great, but your application, your website will change, will need new translations at some point. So what does that look like? Well, obviously your content is almost certainly going to be in JSON format. And now let's say you need to change 10 keys. And so that'll be, two things across 5 files. And let's say you have 7 locales. So you said to be super efficient, you make the changes in your JSON file to indicate that there's some sort of a differential there. You go through, look at the Git view of your code, pull out just the values that you need to be translated, drop those into a spreadsheet. Great. So you fire off your one Excel file for each of the 7 locales. You get that back. Now you've got to change 35 files. And that's kind of error prone because it's, making sure that you copy and paste in this exact key or this exact value for this key in just the right place. But the problem is you probably don't actually speak all 7 of those languages. And so can you ever be 100% sure that you got it right? You can be really, really, really sure. You can pay attention really hard, but it is kind of error prone. But you've done a good job. You did it perfect, and your application is updated. Okay, now 4 weeks later, site changes, product changes, and you have to make more changes. Now you got to go through that whole process again and be really, really sure again. And this is going to keep happening because that's the life cycle of products. And so that risk kind of just stacks as you go through this. And there's a decent chance at some point it ends up being a problem. And if it is something that is an important part of a page, and is an important locale for your product or service, you can lose customers just by having a big screw up in there where the content of your paragraph is in some other section of your page and you swap your headers and the flow of your layout doesn't really make sense. So just error prone, and again, worth paying attention to. Okay, let's look a little further up the road now to a layout change for a page. Let's say you have one very large page that's been sort of the home of one topic that you cover on your website. Now that page needs to change. It needs to be broken up into 4 pages. Well, that means that your keys are going to change. Likely the nesting of your keys is going to change. And now this process that we used last time to, be super, super careful about making sure that we grab just the right JSON keys, it's more complex now. It's a lot more error prone than it was previously. It's hard to keep track of, and nobody on your team is real sure how to do this in a clean way. Likely, it's just going to mean adding new keys, maybe keeping track of the old ones, erasing those old keys out of your JSON. But with human translation, because of it sort of being a game of telephone, it's just a cost you have to be aware of on top of, by the way, the substantial cost to actually have content human translated. Let me give you an example. Okay, let's take a look at one example service that offers professional human expert translation services. Their website is getblend.com. If you're curious, they're not a sponsor. We've just used them previously. So anyway, I've uploaded the JSON files for our website, which is render.io. I forgot to mention at the top of the video. Um, and we have about 500 keys or so. And I've selected the 5 languages that we currently have our website localized into. And you can see we're looking at about 2,500 pounds here. So, not exactly chump change. And for instance, if you want to add translation and editing by a professional in the industry, I'm not actually sure how that one's different than this one, other than it's considerably more expensive. But anyway, that's 300 pounds. So, worth considering when you're choosing your localization strategy. Doing this via API, yeah, there's going to be some difference in quality, but it'll be a lot cheaper than this. It's a large one. Obviously, if your organization, you may not have the chance or the choice to choose to use an API, and you just may have to, as a part of the project budget, eat the cost every time you want to update your content. So, worth knowing. Okay, so let's say after taking a look at the process and cost involved in human translations, machine translations are looking like a decent option, or at least you're curious. So, what you're going to want to do is decide on a service. Let's say you're using DeepL, and because of course you still do need a way to translate your content. So, let's say you want to grab your JSON content, you want to copy and paste it into the DeepL GUI. The problem is that DeepL will translate at least some of the keys from your JSON, which actually causes one of the problems I said to make sure that you avoid with human translations. Now, it's maybe less of an issue because you're sitting with the content there in front of you at your machine. You can do a spot check, but we verified this and it definitely does happen. And depending on what your keys are, it can be a substantial number of them. And again, error prone. So, an option, a much cheaper option, and you're in control of the process end to end as the developer, but still worth paying attention to. Okay, and then aside from this, there actually needs to be somebody on your team who is in charge of it. It can be a number of people who are in charge of it, but somebody has to have this sort of become part of their job description. If you're using human translations, there's a good chance that that person is not actually on the dev team, is maybe more on the business side of things, and that is not currently part of their role if it's something that's new to your organization. And so somebody's going to have to be put in charge of that. And that person already has other responsibilities. And so, while it may take 2 or 3 days, as you saw on Blend, actually, I don't think I showed that, but Blend was quoting like 2 or 3 days to get the content back to you. That's pretty fast. And that's much faster than most organizations are able to make that happen. I've had customers actually, well, just one where it took quite this long, where it took them a month to get any translations back. And this wasn't, just the failure of the process. This was the quoted expected time for them to receive new content, work with external translators, et cetera, and get the content back and ready to be added to the application. So this can vary a lot. But anyway, the point is that somebody needs to be in charge of this. And it needs to be worked into your overall development and product release process. Now, this is worth knowing. If you haven't done a lot of projects, this may be new to you. If you have, you definitely know this. And it is that content almost always comes last. So, as you're planning your project, you will tell your customer or your team, we need to make sure that we have the content early on, especially because it has to be translated now. It helps with layout, etc., to understand how much content is there going to be, what they're going to say. It helps to size the content, to lay out the content, know what to put in buttons. How big are the buttons? Are they big or are they small? Okay, after you've identified who is going to be responsible for managing translations in your organization, it's also going to be really important to understand the content process, how it flows from the people who understand what the product or the website needs to say to the development team to actually do the implementation. Now, you can ask for this content as early and as often as you want on a project. I can almost guarantee you're going to get it at the end. That's just the way it works. I've worked on projects where that was the exception, but they were very much the exception. It's just, I don't know if it's because people put it at the end of their day and they never get to it, or it's just because you don't actually have as full of an understanding of what you're actually accomplishing until you kind of see the project there in front of you. But the thing is, it can definitely affect project timelines. And when you add in internationalization on top of it, it definitely affects project deadlines or project timelines because you get your content finally in your default locale, but then of course it has to go after the translators, and that can take anywhere from, if you're using an API, a half hour or something to days or even a month, as I said. So your launch date for your product or the release date of a new version of your product or website needs to take that into account because there is an extra layer, an extra part of the process now on the thing that generally always comes at the end. So worth knowing. Part three, international law. Now, this is obviously a giant topic that we can't begin to cover at any depth, but we do want to give you a few pointers. Point number one would be if you are a US company and you're looking to expand into Europe, one of the very first things you're going to have to consider is managing consent for cookies. Obviously, in the US, this is not an issue. In Europe, it is absolutely a requirement. So you're going to need to make sure that one, you have a cookie banner, and I would advise using a custom cookie banner that fits with your layout and your branding and is not one of the full page interstitial layouts. Those are very annoying and they pop up immediately. And so the user hasn't actually gotten a chance to evaluate whether they want to have any sort of a marketing relationship with you. So the only thing they can possibly really choose is to reject all of your cookies. And that way you can lose tracking data, marketing analytics data, etc. Versus if you do something that doesn't obstruct the view of your content, users do get the chance to actually evaluate your site and see if they're interested in that or not. Now, obviously, your analytics tool is going to need to be integrated into this banner. If people reject your cookies, you have to not track them. If they accept them, obviously go ahead and do so. That said, you're also going to need to make sure that the analytics tool you are using is actually an acceptable option in the new geographies that you want to target. So this is actually kind of surprising. I learned this in one of Theo's videos, but in many countries in Europe, Google Analytics is actually banned. In Austria, France, Italy, Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden, this according to this resource here. And Sweden has actually even issued a significant fine of $1 million for using GA. So that's something you're going to want to pay attention to. And again, to credit Theo here, Post Hog is a pretty good option if you're looking for something to move on beyond GA. I think most people are pretty unhappy with the latest version of Google Analytics. It's hard to get the data you want. Post Hog is a pretty good option if you're looking for something else. So definitely give them a look. Again, not a sponsor. Your privacy policy is also something that you're going to need to take into account when you decide to expand into new geographies. Different places have different laws, and you need to make sure that you're complying with them when you decide to expand into new markets. You also need to decide whether you want to localize your privacy policy or not. Now, this can get really expensive because it's not just translating the content, it's also making sure that you comfortably can speak legalese in Japanese. And so you want to make sure that you have a lawyer who can actually review this content, who speaks that language natively, knows your subject matter, et cetera, et cetera. You have to decide if that process is worth it for you at all. Another point in Europe, anytime you add, change, or remove a vendor, at least one that affects what's tracked and how data is managed on your website or in your software, you will have to update your privacy policy as well to include that information. Another important one to consider is, will your prospects in your new chosen geography even be able to do business with you? Now, if if your product or service is a B2C offering, the answer is likely yes. It's probably, if you're selling t-shirts across international borders, people pull out their credit card and then there's the cost of shipping. Not a big deal. For B2B, this very well may not be the case. For B2B, there's a very good chance that you will need to open a subsidiary company in the new geographies that you want to target, or at least in the economic region. There can be compliance reasons around this. Maybe companies aren't allowed to do business with your geography or with your economic region. Or perhaps, it goes beyond just compliance. It's also passing the sniff test, right? When you go into a new geography, companies are going to be used to seeing other companies talk about themselves in a way that verifies that they're a valid company, they're trustworthy, whatnot. This can look like, additional information about their company registration, how they do banking, whatever, in the footer of their website. And that can be easy to overlook as you evaluate we can go into these markets or whatever. And it can, you can kind of take the attitude of, oh, this is just some text that we'll need to add to the footer. Well, that text that you need to add to the footer can actually end up costing you more than the entire investment that you made in your website to market your product. If you have to set up a new company, you have to be able to comply with new tax laws, et cetera, et cetera. So again, beyond compliance, there's making sure that your company looks like what companies are expected to look like in the geography that you're targeting. And that can be pretty nuanced and it can take some time to figure out. So there can definitely be a ramp up period even after you, let's say, establish your subsidiary and have localized your content. You'll still have to take a few swings at figuring out exactly how to talk to people in these geographies. Last item here is just going to be another one on privacy. You need to make sure that in addition to your privacy policy, that again, if you're targeting Europe, but also many geographies around the world, you're going to have to let users manage the data that you collect on them. You're going to have to remove their data if they ask you to. Many geographies around the world now require that. You're going to have to look at whether you are allowed to host data on citizens of these new geographies in your, let's say, default geography, the geography where you're currently based. In many cases, the answer is no. And you'll have to set up new infrastructure in these new geographies that you want to target and make sure that everything kind of stays siloed, but that your application still works. So, another big one to look into. Okay, you can officially say that you are no longer an internationalization grasshopper. You've made it halfway through this series. You're aware of some pretty important concepts that go well beyond just following the Next.js docs on internationalization. That said, we are only halfway. And just as a bit of a preview for video 4, it's the video that I've been looking forward to the most to making for the entire series. We have some really cool stuff to show you, and it's going to address a lot of the things that we raised in this video. So if you got some value from this video, if you enjoyed it, if you learned something, give us a thumbs up and subscribe because you are not going to want to miss the rest of this series. See you next time.